Your conversion to realizing that Pol Pot was a mass murderer, and you've finally seen the light on that, have you, Mr. Chomsky?
No, I've seen exactly the light that I saw at the beginning. There's been a vast amount of lying on this topic, including an article which happens to be right before me in today's Daily Camera.
Which I wrote.
Which you wrote. Well, let me describe to you the... Okay. Then, fine, then let me... Okay. There's no time here. You know, it takes a phrase to produce a lie and 10 minutes to decode it, so I'll just take one, the one you've just mentioned. Let's take the Pol Pot atrocities, okay? You say here somewhere that everybody knows that Pol Pot killed 2 million people, or some phrase to that extent, something like that. Okay, let's look at that 2 million people and what I wrote about it.
He killed no one, according to you, right? In this
Pardon?
book here. In this book by you, you say he killed virtually no one.
After the cataclysm.
Yes.
And you can look and check exactly what I'm saying.
You said it was a well-orchestrated campaign of hysteria.
And may I finish
Yes.
on the 2 million? Okay. The figure of 2 million people killed was produced in February 1977. This is all described in detail in the book by Jean Lacouture, a French journalist, who was reviewing a book by a French priest named François Panchaud, which had just come out in French. It was fine. About a year or two later, it was translated into English, and you can read it if you don't read French. It was called Cambodia Year Zero. That was the only book at that point by anyone who had any direct or sort of plausible knowledge of what was going on in Cambodia, so it was an important book. It appeared in France in January 1977. It was immediately reviewed in the New York Review of Books, translating an article, a review that just appeared in France.
Did you kind of come to the point?
I'll get to the point. I'll get to the point.
The review and all that.
I told you it takes 10 minutes to decode a lie, and I'm now decoding it, okay? In this review, Jean Lacouture stated that according to Panchaud, Pol Pot had killed, in fact, he didn't talk about Pol Pot because nobody knew him then. He said the Khmer Rouge have boasted, that was his word, of killing 2 million people. That's where the figure of 2 million comes from that you've heard over and over again since. Well, I was interested. I hadn't seen figures like that. So, and the book was not available in the United States. Incidentally, Lacouture's review was immediately picked up by the press, quoted all over the place. Oh, isn't this fantastic and horrifying? They've killed 2 million people. Incidentally, in July 1975, 2 years earlier, the New York Times had already accused them of genocide. But now we had support from Panchaud, the French priest, high source, says they killed 2 million people. Well, I had no opinion on it one way or another. So I did the obvious thing. I wrote to some friends in France and asked them to mail me the book, because no copy of it existed in the United States. It was being quoted all over the place. Everybody was quoting it, but it didn't exist. So I got a copy of the French book. And here's what I discovered. Here's the source of your 2 million figures. I discovered that according to Panchaud, the United States was responsible for the death of 800,000 Cambodians in the bombing in the war in the first half of the decade. And then he says, according to the American embassy, the Pol Pot regime is responsible for 1.2 million deaths from all causes, including killing, starvation, overwork, etc. All right, Lacouture read that. He added up the two figures, the alleged claim of the American embassy and Panchaud's claim about the American war, added them up, comes to 2 million, attributed it all to Pol Pot. That was the 2 million figure. Well, I did the next obvious thing. I wrote a personal letter to Lacouture in which I said, look, I don't know what's going on in Cambodia, but you misquoted Panchaud. I gave a series of misquotes. It turns out that every reference of his to the book was a total
for a moment?
May I continue?
We have some Cambodians
May I continue?
Here.
I will just a second. You asked me to talk about your particular lie. I will now talk about it, okay? If you wanted me to talk about other lies, I'll talk about them. If you'll bear with me on this, it's a very illuminating story about the way a system of indoctrination works and about the way commissars work. Let's continue.
Cambodians and
may I continue?
Let's go.
May I continue? You don't want me to, you don't want to. It's plain that you don't want to hear this, and I understand why, but let me continue anyway. I won't take the time to go through the other lies. I just mentioned that one. Okay, I mentioned to Lacouture that his falsification of Panchaud's book was now being widely quoted, and I thought that was improper. I thought he ought to report what Ponchot actually said. He then wrote an article which appeared in the United States, in which he thanked me for calling to his attention a number of errors. In fact, it turned out everything that he'd referred to was totally false, but let's forget that. And he corrected a few of them, not all, but a few. In the case of the number of people killed, here's what he said. He said maybe the number killed was thousands or hundreds of thousands. But he said, did it really matter? In other words, did it really matter whether the actual number was in the thousands or in the millions? No, he said, it doesn't matter, it's about the same. And everyone thought that was just wonderful and very heroic, and after that, everyone continued to quote the 2 million figure, even after he had said, well, maybe it's in the thousands, and of course I misquoted. Now, just imagine that somebody were to say that about an American atrocity, you know? I mean, like in El Salvador, the United States is responsible for 50,000 deaths in the last 5 years. Suppose somebody came along and said, well, it's 50 million deaths, or 5 billion deaths, a factor of 1,000. Suppose somebody wrote, the United States is responsible for 5 billion deaths, you know, or 50 million deaths in El Salvador. And then suppose somebody said, well, look, you know, you misquoted and so on. And he says, well, after all, what's a factor of 1,000, you know? I mean, we would think that that's ludicrous. Of course a factor of 1,000 matters. It matters whether it's 1,000 killed is an atrocity. But millions killed, in particular a boast of millions killed, that's a very different atrocity. Factor of these things did matter. You know, factor of 100, a factor of 1,000, all of those things matter. I wrote an article, and after Lacouture said he didn't think it mattered, not I, in fact, but a colleague of mine named Edward Herman, an economist at the University of Pennsylvania, he and I wrote an article in The Nation in which we gave the first actual review of Ponchot's book. Ponchot's book is the standard source on this, and we wrote the first review of it. I discount Lacouture's review because everything in it was totally false. The book had not yet appeared in English, but we wrote a review of the book in The Nation. It's June 25th, 1977. You can look it up. And in it, we praised Ponchot's book as serious and worth reading, with its report of the grisly atrocities committed by the Khmer Rouge and their barbarity. And we said we have no idea what the actual numbers are. How could we know? But on the basis of his book, they're probably serious. And we ran through the range of, we also said we disagreed with Lacouture about the question of a factor of 1,000. We thought it mattered whether the number killed was in the thousands or the millions. Incidentally, in the same review, we also pointed out that Ponchot had very significantly exaggerated the atrocities due to the American bombing. You'll notice that nobody's minded that. We have never been criticized for pointing out that Ponchot exaggerated the number of killings due to the United States. Excuse me. No, he's not. I'll go on with the rest. Yeah, that was the first book that existed, and it's the major source. Okay, and that's all we wrote at that time. Okay, that's the basis of your first. Then in the book that you're talking about was written in 1978, and it appeared in 1979 after the fall of the Pol Pot regime. Written in 1978, it used more evidence up through early 1978. Now, in that book, we started off by saying that the Khmer Rouge are responsible for what we called gruesome atrocities, and we went on to describe them. But our book was not about Cambodia. It was about the American propaganda system. This is one chapter in a 2-volume work on the American propaganda system, in which we compared the way the other guy's atrocities are treated with the way our atrocities are treated. And the point that we made with 2 volumes of documentation is that when it's the other guy's atrocities, the press vastly exaggerates them and fabricates and so on, and what's our atrocities, they suppress them and remain quiet about them and so on. One of dozens of cases discussed is Cambodia, and we pointed out this example, but we also pointed out something else. We pointed out that the only people who knew anything about Cambodia was American intelligence. Okay? I mean, they actually had evidence about Cambodia. They were monitoring it closely. And in fact, by then I had contacted State Department intelligence to find out what they were saying, and it's given in there. What they were saying, first of all, they said that this claim of Ponchot's about 1.2 million was an invention. They had never produced any such thing. And then they said, and in fact this was said in public, and we quote it in the book, in mid-1977, which is about the latest evidence, they said that the number of people killed by, they said that no doubt that there are atrocities, they said it's in the tens or hundreds of thousands, not from mass genocide, but from brutal overwork and harsh conditions. So American intelligence estimate was tens or hundreds of thousands, and we cited that as well. We came out with no conclusion of our own about the numbers. In fact, we ended up by saying, well, maybe the 2 million figure will turn out to be right, even if it was totally fabricated. But tentatively, we assumed that American intelligence was probably right. Okay? Now let's turn to the last point. Now there's a lot of evidence. See, after the fall of the Pol Pot regime, a lot of evidence came out. Okay, I've now finished with everything I wrote about the topic, which was perfectly accurate. No one has ever found one minor error even. There have been lies, like what you just heard, but no errors. Now let's turn to another question. What the actual numbers are. Well, here you can turn to subsequent scholarship. It's certainly not known in detail, but there is subsequent scholarship. In fact, there are two major sources at the moment. One of them is a book on the Pol Pot period by the only authentic Cambodia scholar who has written on the topic, Michael Vickery. He's actually American. In fact, he was actually in the Foreign Service. He's a specialist on Cambodia, speaks Khmer. His wife's family was all massacred by Pol Pot. He worked in the refugee camps and so on, and he has a book called Cambodia, 1975 to 1979, in which he gives a detailed demographic study, you know, region by region, putting together whatever evidence he could, and so on and so forth. The book was very highly praised in England by Indochina scholars and so on and so forth. It's never been reviewed in the United States, that was published here. His conclusion is that, except in marginal journals, in fact, a professor here reviewed it in the monthly review. I will tell you, because this is important, that's why. That's why. Let me, do you want to know the answer to this question or don't you? You don't, okay. Well, all right, let me just ask for a show of hands. How many people want me to give you this answer? Okay. Then, the final remark, what is his, do you want to hear what the scholarly record shows? Yes, okay. His estimate is that the total number who died above what would be expected if you had had regular population growth is about 700,000. There's another study by the one government that carried out an official inquiry into this, the government of Finland. Of course, again, never mentioned in the United States. They come out with somewhat lower estimates. The State Department journal Problems of Communism came out with a still lower estimate. There are people, incidentally, who are apologists for Pol Pot. The government scholar Douglas Pike, who now heads the Indochina Resource Center, according to him, Pol Pot was, I'm quoting, the charismatic leader of a peasant revolution under whom the population didn't suffer anywhere near as much as they said. However, I haven't said any of these things. I've just reported the facts. Now, why does that bother people so much? Because what Herman and I did was we took the position that it is not proper to lie, either in suppressing the crimes of your own state or exaggerating the crimes of an official enemy. And of course, the commissars who insist on the right to lie are outraged by this. Do you want to go on to the next lie, this one having been discussed?